I'm constantly surprised when I see Jim's work, because it just is like, oh wow, that's, even more amazing, or so different than what I imagined, right? But I'm never shocked, right? It's never like, oh my God, how did he do that? You're like, well, of course he can do that. Look at everything else he's done, right?
Welcome to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today I am joined by Haden Blackman. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I've been, as you can tell from many interviews I've done with J.H. Williams III, I'm a big fan of Echolands and of J.H. Williams III and of your Batwoman run.
Oh, thanks.
And so on and so forth.
Okay.
You are both in video games and in comics. Why do you love both of them? What does one have over the other? How do they compare?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, first and foremost, I like telling stories, and both are fantastic mediums for that. And I think I've gravitated towards stories that obviously combine the visual with the prose, and both of them, both video games and comic books do that incredibly well. They are very, very different mediums, though. So with comics, the thing that I really enjoy the most is that, one, it's a relatively small collaborative effort. Obviously we have a team of 5 or 6 at most working on a comic, and so it feels very kind of tight and collaborative in that sense. And there's also no real kind of special effects budget in comics or art budget in comics beyond the talent of the artists. And obviously you budget how many panels on a page. You can't cram too many panels into a page, and you budget how many words you can put into a bubble or those types of things. But if I want to go from, as you see in Echolands, if I want to go from Horror Hill on one page to Meadow Mountain on the next, I can do that, and it doesn't blow the budget, which is not necessarily true in games. With games, we like in film, we have to be really cognizant of the budgets, and you're dealing with much larger teams. So collaboration is still really exciting, but it's just different. It operates at kind of a different level because you're dealing with dozens, if not hundreds of people. And then the biggest difference is just the interactivity that you have to plan for in games. The player has to be part of the story. They have to be engaged in kind of not just the narrative you're telling, but the player story as well. Obviously with comics, we're telling you a story, and we want you to be immersed and invested in the world, but there's not that interactivity that you have in games, which is a really exciting but also very complex aspect of game development.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you don't blow the budget going from Meadow Mountain to Horror Hill, but you do lengthen the time it takes for JH to draw.
That's true. that is true, right? So the quality, obviously, of the art and the types of things that we're trying to deliver, I don't want to dismiss that. Obviously, Jim is amazing with his level of detail, and the stuff that he's doing for Horror Hill is just fantastic. So that is absolutely true. But I think, again, one of the beauties with games is with comics, is that we can do something like Echolands, where you jump from art style to art style to art style, and just because of the specific types of technology we use to make games, that's a little bit more difficult. To have a black and white Frankenstein's monster standing next to somebody rendered in kind of the color palette of and style and almost geometry of Romulus, for example.
Can you name some comics that sparked your love of comics when you were a younger lad?
So I learned to read from comic books. We would go on family trips, and I'm one of 5 boys, so we had a car full of kids, and I'm in the middle. And my dad, every time we'd go on a trip, would pull into 7-Eleven and walk into and pull a bunch of comic books off the rack and throw them into the back of the car to kind of keep us quiet to read. But he was he wasn't very discerning in what he picked. So you would have Richie Rich and Swamp Thing, side by side.
Yeah.
So I think I was probably 6 or 7, and I was reading Swamp Thing. So Swamp Thing was very formative for me. Alan Moore's run in particular was amazing. I'm a huge Bernie Wrightson fan too. So once I kind of really got into comics and started going back and finding older runs, the Bernie Wrightson, Len Wein Swamp Things were, really kind of important to me. I have a huge run of X-Men that I really fell in love with after kind of coming to them through Secret Wars and New Mutants was kind of how I discovered the X-Men. But that
Bill
kind of soap
Sienkiewicz's New
opera that the
Mutants?
X-Men tell. Yes, absolutely, yeah. So from the very beginning. So
Yeah.
and then Alpha Flight. I loved Alpha Flight. So a lot of Marvel stuff. But one of the very first comics I ever read was Death of Captain Marvel, which is interesting because I knew who Spider-Man was, but I didn't know who a lot of the other characters were. So just poring over every page of Death of Captain Marvel and seeing, who is that character? That Hercules looks cool, or Tigra, or all these other characters. Or Beast. I had no idea who Beast was when I first read Death of Captain Marvel. So those are some of my early ones. So a lot of Marvel stuff, a little bit of DC, early Firestorm, Blue Devil. I was there at the very beginning of Blue Devil, and then Teen Titans. Teen Titans was really big for me. So both Teen Titans and New Mutants were kind of side by side. So a lot of big superhero stuff. And then as I got older, I moved into, I discovered some of the Dark Horse things. There was a comic book called Grips, which was a really violent black and white comic when I was a teenager that I was kind of fascinated with. Dead World. I loved Dead World, the first run of Dead World. So I was kind of all over the map as I got older.
Yeah.
And then discovered Jim with kind of Chase and Promethea, and that really kind of exploded what I thought you could do with art. So
It's interesting that you mentioned all of that about the death of Captain Marvel, because I think a lot of fans, especially fans who have been reading comics for a very long time, they'll, well, even me, I'm guilty of it too. Like, we'll try to say, oh yeah, that's not new reader friendly, right?
Yeah.
We have no idea what new reader friendly actually is.
Totally. And that was the thing for me. I was a kid, and I walked into Walden Books, which is local bookstore, and they had it there, and I was like, well, this looks cool. I have no idea it's superheroes. I have no idea who any of these people are, and I read it. I had no idea who Captain Marvel was, and it was still a very moving story, even not knowing that. I mean, I knew he was kind of like Superman. That was all I needed to know, but it pulled me in, and then led to Contest of Champions and Secret Wars and all these kind of big mashups with all these characters, and then into their individual books beyond that. So yeah, for me, it was like the perfect entry to comics as the first kind of graphic novel.
It's okay. It's okay to jump into the middle of things, because you don't need to know everything about every single character. Whatever you need to know will be given to you, which actually goes into how you start Echolands.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Because how you start Echolands is like, here they are, and you fill it up as you go along.
So I got a piece of writing advice once. Randy Stradley, who was an editor at Dark Horse for a long time, one of my early editors on some of the Star Wars comics that I wrote, he gave me a piece of advice once, was to start the story as far into the story as you possibly can without losing the reader. And hopefully that's what we've achieved with Echolands, right? I mean, Hope has stolen the gem. She's already on the run from the wizard and his goons, when the story starts, and we kind of throw you in at this kind of breakneck pace, which I think, has its advantages and challenges, but it was a piece of advice I took to heart, and I hopefully it's working well in Echolands.
It's more, for me, that kind of thing is more exciting than, starting from the very beginning, because I don't know if, maybe younger readers won't relate to it, but when you're consuming media in the 90s, you came in to the middle of things.
Yeah.
You came in the middle of a show, you came in the middle of a movie. If you're just flipping through the channels, you're coming in the middle of a comic book. Right. So yeah. Do you have any particular direct influences from writers that you take with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of all over the map. I mean, I knew from a pretty early age I wanted to be a writer, and as I said, comic books were really formative for me. So Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman, discovering Sandman when that first came out, again, was kind of a revelation, because you're like, oh, you can do, I mean, I knew you could kind of hit some of those types of themes and beats because of Swamp Thing, and I'm trying to remember the order, Swamp Thing and Watchmen and Sandman, but it was all kind of in that mix, right? So definitely Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman on that front. And then just in terms of, kind of novelists, and I'm a huge Stephen King fan. It's really interesting because when I was a kid, I, consumed, every Stephen King book, and a couple other kind of his contemporaries. There's a writer named Robert McCammon who wrote a book called Swan Song, which I still think is one of the best post-apocalyptic novels ever written. And then you kind of fall out of it, and then I rediscovered, him again later. And Stephen King, and he's just such an easy read, and there's, and the characters are so well defined, and he's just so engaging, draws you in so quickly. So I'm big fan there. And then there's a writer called Pete Dexter, who I think is maybe one of the greatest, American novelists ever. He wrote a book called Paris Trout, and a book that's semi-autobiographical called Spooner, which is really funny, and a book called Deadwood, which was one of the basis for the Wild Bill movie. So it's all about Wild Bill Hickok, and it's serious and funny and poignant all at once. So and I just try and read a lot. Roger Zelazny was a science fiction author, fantasy science fiction author when I was growing up. I consumed a lot of his, Piers Anthony, a lot of the usual suspects from that standpoint. And then today, one of my favorite writers is a guy named Joe Abercrombie, who writes a lot of kind of grim, dark fantasy, and is, but really kind of moves along fast and kind of engages you with these characters that, are just super memorable and gripping from moment one.
How did you break into video games?
So I started my career, I was a creative writing major in college. When I graduated, I went into publishing, and I was working at a literary agency as kind of a submissions editor, and ended up doing a lot of ghostwriting there. Ghost wrote a couple nonfiction books and helped edit a book that became an Oprah selection, and did a couple book deals as kind of a junior agent, I guess, but also sold a couple of my own books, one on monsters and one on hauntings. So again, kind of right up my alley in terms of the things that I'm interested in.
The Field Guide to North American Monsters, the Field Guide to North American Hauntings.
That's right. Yeah. Those books are now really old, but those were my first kind of published work. And so they were kind of tongue in cheek, although the hauntings one is a little less tongue in cheek because, it's a lot easier to take that stuff seriously, but they were kind of tongue in cheek field guides to, folklore of North America. So either hauntings or monsters. And then the publishing industry was kind of at a rocky point in time, and I was still pretty young, and I was like, well, if I'm going to make a career move, it's a great time to do it. So I started looking around, and a friend of mine was working at Lucas Learning, which was the educational division of Lucasfilm. Lucasfilm Games. They had this kind of educational division called Lucas Learning. And she told me about an opening at LucasArts for a writer. And I had always been a big, gamer growing up. Interesting enough, was not a massive Star Wars fan. Like I love the movies, and Empire Strikes Back was, probably it's always been in my top 10 movies, right? So it wasn't like I didn't like movies, but I hadn't read any of the comics, wasn't up to speed on the novels, had not, really kept up with the expanded universe. But they hired me to basically work on an encyclopedia of the Star Wars universe. And I really fell in love with the universe because it was so cohesive. And it was funny because my first day there, somebody told me, well, good luck. You're going to have a really hard time, making all this stuff kind of fit. And, I'm sure there's tons of contradictions, and you're going to have to sort through, retcon some things and sort through a lot of, inconsistencies. And that wasn't true at all. The Lucasfilm licensing had done a great job over the years, keeping everything kind of, in line and correct, and nothing conflicted. I was shocked. So I fell in love with kind of the universe and the depth of the universe and all the things that people had added to it. And I stayed at LucasArts. It was supposed to be a 6-month gig, and I stayed there for 13 years and eventually, wrote a bunch of things. And then, my role grew kind of on the creative side. And I eventually did some voice directing and was the creative director on the Force Unleashed franchise, wrote those stories and kind of led them from a kind of creative and production standpoint. And it's just a fascinating industry. So I really saw the potential of storytelling games. So I stuck around, past my 6 months and stayed there for 13 years. And then it kind of became my career.
I was going to say, of course you weren't a big Star Wars fan. You actually like Star Wars.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I really fell in love with it. It was amazing. Yeah. It was one of those, I remember the day of my interview, my roommate, who was kind of a bigger Star Wars fan, he had posted notes all over the apartment. And as I was leaving, I was looking, I'm going, they're not going to ask me trivia questions in this interview. And of course, they asked me trivia questions in the interview, and one of them was, "What's the name of Boba Fett's ship?" And I would have never known it was Slave One if if he hadn't put that post-it note up, and that was one of the trivia questions, right? But there's just so much rich, and it's so rich, and there's so much depth to it, and it just, it's a universe of infinite possibilities. So that, it was really fun to be there at that time, when we were, building games for both original games like Knights of the Old Republic, which took place outside of kind of the existing timelines, and games tied to the prequels, which, I know have their ups and downs, but it was really exciting to be there as those were under development.
Yeah, I mean, as much as like something like the Star Wars prequels get flack, it's still exciting if you're actually working on anything involving it. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's still some great moments. I mean, the pod race sequences, there's moments like that. They're just fantastic, and there's some really memorable. Darth Maul is one of the most memorable characters to come out of Star Wars. Like, it's so there are things I like about them and things I don't like so much about them, but overall, it was just a great time to be part of LucasArts.
How much of being a writer is a writer, especially for a licensed property, is trying to find the things you like and trying to latch onto the things you like and develop the things you like?
That's a really good question. I think at the end of the day, if you're not passionate about what you're working on, no matter what, kind of creative medium you're working in, I think it becomes really difficult. It's really hard not to just phone it in if you're not passionate about it. So with Star Wars, and I've worked with Star Wars, I've worked with, the Lord of the Rings series. When I joined 2K, Mafia was a franchise that already existed. So with a lot of those, I always set, anytime I approach kind of a universe already exists, I kind of did this in my head with Elektra and Batwoman too, is look at what is kind of the franchise pillars and what are the things that I think personally make the franchise really tick and exciting. And then I kind of, again, latch onto those things because clearly they're resonating with me. So with Star Wars, when I was working on the games, the thing that was most exciting was the kind of infinite possibilities in the universe, right? You can be a cowboy, you can be a knight, you can be, a bounty hunter. It's all wrapped in Star Wars, but it's so rich, and you can kind of almost have any fantasy, fulfilled there, which is why I really enjoyed working on games like Star Wars Galaxies, which was a big, massive multiplayer online game that allowed you to take on a lot of different roles, or Knights of the Old Republic, which again, similarly, allows you to kind of become a variety of different things. And then thematically, I think it's really important too to kind of find the themes that resonate with you. So, and it's kind of easy with Star Wars because it's that battle of good versus evil, but it's also, there's the battle for the soul. So, working on Force Unleashed, we were able to, portray this really damaged character in Starkiller who is wrestling with kind of his allegiance to Vader, and then show how Vader's very, very damaged, and it's almost that Frankenstein monster kind of pity for him, right?
Yeah.
Which is something. Oh, I didn't realize I'm wearing a shirt with Frankenstein monster on it. One of my favorite characters, as you can probably imagine, that Echolands. I used to have a big poster of him behind me, but we just repainted the walls.
Yes, I hear you're a big fan of 70s horror movies.
I love all horror movies, to be honest. Like, that's the thing. Again, growing up, my it was comic, like my parents probably could distill it. It was comic books, weird fiction, so horror and sci-fi and fantasy and horror movies. I mean, I could not get enough. But my favorites were always the Universal stuff. I love Frankenstein's monster and Creature from the Black Lagoon, and the Wolfman, all that stuff. I wanted to be friends with them and hang out with them. Monster Squad was like for a while was like my favorite movie, because it's like, I want to be those kids.
Yeah, Universal Monsters cinematic universe, that fell through, didn't it?
Yeah. Unfortunately.
What do you think they did wrong with that one?
I don't. It's hard because I can only imagine making movies is really, really hard, because I know making games is really, really hard, right? So and a lot of it is, with any game you make, there's one part of it is luck, right? You kind of got to hit at the right time, and everything's got to kind of come together in the right way, and you have to have the right people and the right idea that hits at the right time. And the ideas are the easy part, and it's all the execution. So I don't really want to cast stones at kind of the failings of those films. But I mean, me personally, if I were to take it on, you know, I didn't think that the Dracula one, Dracula Untold, I didn't think that was terrible. I actually enjoyed that movie quite a bit. But you got to decide what you are and what those monsters are, right? And to me, like Dracula's supposed to be scary, like he's supposed to be threatening, supposed to be the villain, you know. And it's weird for me to turn him the hero, which is why, again, going back to Monster Squad, the heart of Monster Squad is like you got these characters that are, I mean, Dracula's the villain, but you have Frankenstein's monster who's sympathetic, you know, and that's a natural conflict there that you could play up, right? So I think rather than trying to put them all together and say, well, they're, you know, Dracula's whatever, Tony Stark, and, you know, Frankenstein's monster is Captain America or whatever, the whole, I think, you know, looking at it in terms of what do these characters lend themselves to in terms of archetypes, they're not superheroes, you know. And you can still have a really interesting conflict with those characters and bring, because those Monster Mash movies from the, you know, the Universal Monster Mash movies are awesome. I mean, like, again, as a kid, I couldn't wait to watch those, and I was always disappointed that you didn't have more fights between, you know, Dracula and Frankenstein, right? Like, that's what I want to see. I want to see those guys going toe to toe. I don't want to see them joining forces against the government. I mean, like that, you know, that's not exciting.
The
they
army
need to throw down, right? Yeah, right. Or some, you know, vampire that they made up that I don't know, right? It's like, no, I want to see Dracula and Frankenstein's monster tearing into each other, you know.
You ever, this is a complete digression. You ever see that 1980s Spider-Woman cartoon?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, there was this one episode where she fights Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman.
I remember that vaguely. Yeah,
and it was so ridiculous.
Yeah, no, but again, it's like as a kid, you're like, sign me up, right? Totally. You pitched that to me, I'm like, I'm gonna watch that. Or the one I tried to make my kids watch it, like, I don't know, last Halloween, and they didn't want anything to do. But there was that old, I think it was just called, was it Mad Monster Party? But it was one of those stop motion, like it's the same group that did the Rudolph the Reindeer.
And Frosty the Snowman shows.
They did, but they did a monster one where all the monsters show up on this island, right? And they're like plotting against one another, and there's this whole little back, and there's musical numbers and everything. I'm sure it doesn't hold up very well, but as a kid, I was like, that's what I want to see. I want to see all those guys together in one place, you know, like plotting against one another, and, you know, having, you know, kind of fights and adventures together, and having them be rivals, but also, you know, knowing they're the only monsters in the world. There's a lot of richness there, I think, right? So
also sometimes things that don't hold up well have a level of charm that makes them absolutely fun to watch.
100%, right?
Yeah, it's completely different if the reason that it doesn't hold up well is like because it's like racist or something.
Right, yeah, which again, I'm sure there's some stuff in that is maybe, you know, inappropriate. I'd have to go back and watch it again just because of the time that it was made.
How, as a fan, did you grow into a fan of J.H. Williams III?
So I was fortunate because I met him pretty early on. So he had been, I think he had just started his run on Promethea when I first met him, and we met through mutual friend Alex Sinclair, who was a colorist. So I had met Alex actually through a buddy of mine who worked at Lucas, and we were going down to San Diego Comic-Con, so we were meeting up, and we ended up going to dinner with some folks from I guess it was maybe Image at the time, but we ended up going to dinner, which is kind of a cross section of us. And I ended up sitting next to Jim and just chatting. And, you know, we discovered we had a lot in common. And I had already started reading Prometheus, you know, kind of blown away by it. And I'll tell you that, like, the two things that I'll never forget is opening up Prometheus and flipping through and realizing, you know, just I was becoming more and more self-conscious about working in comics because of the portrayal of women in particular in comics at the time. And almost like, you know, like, oh, I'm reading a comic, I'm embarrassed to have my, you know, my at the time I think it was my fiance, but my, you know, who's not my wife, but I was embarrassed for her to come over and see what I was reading, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, and so I was more and more self-conscious about that. And his portrayal of women in Promethea, and obviously Alan Moore, the writing's amazing, right? But, you know, he can make these women feel strong and sexy without it being salacious or, you know, the proportions being totally out of whack or embarrassing. Like it's like
different body types too. Different body types
exactly
faces.
right, for sure. And it wasn't that same just like cookie cutter approach that you were seeing a lot of the industry, especially in the late 90s. You know,
Yeah, oh yeah.
Coming out of that, right? So
the 90s were not a good time for women in comics.
No, and so I, you know, so I was increasingly self-conscious about that, and I knew it could be done because, like, again, I not afraid to admit, I had a huge crush on you know the with Abby, I think is the Swamp Thing's wife, and you know,
Abby
and the Alan
Arcane.
Moore run, right? Yeah, exactly, right. And like, and again, they never portrayed her in that way, right? It was all, you know, so I knew it could be done in comics. We had just moved away from it, and so to see him be able to tackle those characters and, you know, with such skill was amazing. And then, but then the other thing that, you know, I think was almost unique to Jim at the time was his panel work and like the designs around the panels and how those told a story and added to the world and the richness of the world in and of themselves. I thought that was incredible. Like the amount of thought that he put into like just the borders of the panels. I don't know anybody else that's doing that, you know? And so I think I probably, you know, geeked out with him on that. But we had a lot in common. And then, you know, we obviously I just started reading Prometheus, but then I went back and got, you know, Chase and a bunch of other stuff that he had done. You know, obviously as I got to know him better, my, you know, admiration and fandom for him only grew. So and he's just a fun guy to talk to, you know.
He is, obviously. So
yeah,
because when he was on Starman and Chase, I was like, yeah, he draws a lot like Tony Harris, like back then.
Yeah.
And I felt like they were on similar paths. And then all of a sudden, you know, Tony Harris kept on going in the exact path that you would expect Tony Harris to go in, which is a perfectly fine and valid path, which is great. And I love his artwork.
Right.
But then JH just went like here, and then he went here, and then he it was a real big digression, I guess. And it was like really out of the box and really amazing to look at and see his development.
Yeah, his evolution. I mean, I still have old issues of Chase, you know, and just looking at Chase compared to what he's doing in Echolands now, it's like it's just. I think it's because, you know, and I really admire this about him, and I you know, hope that I do this, you know, in my writing too. Is that I think he's always stretching, right, and he's always pushing himself to try new things. And I think, you know, Echolands is that. I mean, just even the format, you know, the landscape format is different for both of us, right? I mean, I have to think differently as I'm writing you know, as we're working on the scripts and thinking about the reveals a little bit differently and thinking about the space and how we're using the space and you know, how we're going to have the conversations or the dialogue migrate across the space. You know, it's still hard for me to wrap my head around, which feels good. Right? It's like, you know, you're like, oh, I'm stretching a different muscle in my brain, you know, but it's nothing compared to what he's doing in terms of like every panel is like 3 different art styles and 4 different art styles mashed together. You know?
Yeah, I was talking to a Marvel artist, somebody who's only ever really worked for Marvel, I think. And he was asking me who else have had on the show, and I mentioned, you know, JH's name, and he was like, "Oh, he's a real artist." And I'm like, "Well, so are you." He's like, "No, he's a real artist."
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know what that means, but okay.
Yeah.
How'd you hook up with him for Batwoman?
So we had done, so we had stayed, you know, in touch, right? After that first, you know, meeting at Comic-Con, and every time, you know, next Comic-Cons came around, we would hook up and go to dinner or hang out. But we would talk. I mean, we were probably talking monthly and exchanging emails and things like that. And then at one point, I can't remember. I think I got the call from somebody at Dark Horse saying, "Hey, you know, would you be willing to write a story for Hellboy Weird Tales?" I was like, that would be awesome. And they're like, you think you get Jim to draw it? I was like, oh, now I know why you called me. Like, because they knew that I was friends with Jim. So I was like, you know, the editor that had called me, I was like, yeah, let me reach out to them and find out. So Jim and I
very Machiavellian.
I know, right? It's like, you know, whatever, I'll take it. I'll write.
Absolutely. You are manipulating me right now, and I will take it. Good job.
I'm like, write a Hellboy story? No problem. Sure. So I reached out to Jim and said, hey, do you want to try writing this Hellboy story? And I think by that point we had already started kind of talking about maybe working together on something. I can't remember if he had already pitched me the idea, the kind of core idea for Echolands and Hope. yet
That's
or
been a
not.
while, right?
Yeah, I can't remember if it happened before that Hellboy story, or I think it happened before that Hellboy story. So that's so we were already kind of working on Echolands and some Echolands ideas. And we had been talking to a couple of different publishers, including Dark Horse. And then I think they came back to me and said, hey, you want to do this Hellboy thing? So we did the Hellboy Weird Tales story, which it's still one of my favorite things I've ever written, because it's about Hellboy looking for Goatman, who's is in that North American Hauntings book I wrote, right? So it was one of my favorite weird characters that I learned about when I was researching that book. And it was one of the only ones that I didn't know about from, being a kid, because I read all that kind of stuff when I was growing up. So I wrote, we wrote the story about Goatman, and it's a kind of, I think it's kind of a sweet story about Hellboy, feeling a little bit awkward being on these stakeouts with this, female agent. So that was, so we had a great time doing that, and we kind of clicked there. And then we were continuing to work on kind of Echolands, and then the opportunity, we were actually pitching Echolands, and we were getting some traction on it, and it looked like we were going to get close to signing a deal with somebody. And then the Batwoman opportunity surfaced. And so, Jim reached out to me and said, hey, it looks like DC wants to do Batwoman. Do we want to pitch something? And we had actually, if I recall the timeline correctly, we put together a pitch for a limited series first, and went to them and said, hey, we want to do this. I think it was a 5-issue limited series called World Finest, which is Batwoman and Wonder Woman. And, we want to tell this story about Batwoman, Wonder Woman, and DC liked that. And then they're like, well, why don't you guys actually do the, take on the book and do a run of the book? So we're like, oh, okay, well, we'll take World's Finest and we'll make it an arc in the series that we're doing, right? So I think it's the second arc, right? So so that's how that all came about. Yeah, third arc. Thank you. Yeah, so
because you did the second one with Amy Reeder.
Yeah, that's right. So we have Hydrology as the first one with the Weeping Woman, and again drawing on all the monster stuff, which was another thing. Jim was funny because my first trip to Comic-Con, I had, maybe it was my second trip, but one of those early trips, I had copies of that book, the Field Guide North American Hauntings. I gave it out to a few friends. So I gave it to, Dark Horse editor and to Jim and a couple other folks. And I think Jim kept always, like, every time I talked to him, he was like, we should do something with that. We should do something with that. We could totally make a comic book out of Field Guide North American Monsters. And I was like, I don't know how that would work. I don't know what that story would be. So then when that one came along, we were like, oh yeah, let's just pluck some of these urban legends out and throw them into the story and create a whole new, rogues gallery for Batwoman. So it all comes full circle eventually.
You were put on that series because, for controversial reasons, Greg Rucka left. Did you feel any pressure taking over for Greg?
Yeah, I mean, so I always like to say that the pressure I feel is pressure I put on myself, right? Like, I want to do my best work always, right? And I think I like to think I'm my worst critic, right? Or my harshest critic. So there was a lot of pressure there. And then you want to do right by the fans, right? And I knew there were so many fans of Batwoman, and that, and it was, obviously really important to the LGBT community. And I didn't want to mess that up, right? So I actually felt a lot of pressure from that angle of, like, I've relatives who are gay, and I wanted to make sure that they weren't, that they felt like I was doing it justice, and that the character was, it was something that we could all be proud of. And I've got 2 daughters, so I wanted to be able to write a story about a really, flawed but powerful, main, female character, and both actually Kate and Maggie, right? That was really important to us, that we make Maggie more of a 3-dimensional character too, and have her be a really strong kind of, in some ways foil to Kate and Beth too. I mean, all three, like, those 3 characters.
And eventually Wonder Woman.
And eventually Wonder Woman, right? Which I had loads of fun writing Wonder Woman. That was, just a huge honor to be able to do that. So there was a lot of pressure from that standpoint, and you don't want to mess that up. I have huge respect for everything Rucka did. So following in his footsteps, was a little bit daunting, but then we also said, well, we're going to take it in a different direction, right? Like, he told an amazing origin story for her in a way, like, and that relationship between, Batwoman and Alice is phenomenal. And so we were like, how do we kind of build on that thematically and tonally, and that kind of darker, more supernatural side of the kind of DC universe, and and Gotham. So we can kind of make it our own a little bit, but it still feels true to everything he did. But I would say that most of the pressure came from, again, not wanting to trivialize the character. I think maybe that's the best way to put it. And then making sure that Jim felt good about everything that we were doing, right? Because he was the continuity, he was the link between the old series and the first series and the series that we were doing. So that was really important to me. I wanted to make sure that Jim was excited about, every panel he was drawing, and that the stories were ones that he was super invested in.
Yeah, especially since I believe he was hesitant to continue it, wasn't he?
I don't, you probably have to ask him that. That was not necessarily my sense. I mean, I think that I think it was a lot of, again, you should probably ask him. My sense is that Jim, it was his first time kind of writing, right? I mean, we co-wrote the Hellboy story, right? But it was, I think it was this was a major high profile gig that he was going to have his name on as a writer. So I think for him, there was probably a lot of, he wanted to prove that the stories we were telling, and that everything from the dialogue to the pacing to the flow of the arcs, worked, right? And that he could be taken seriously as a writer, which I never, thought was going to be an issue for him, right? I thought that, again, and partly because, comics are both a visual and, I mean, they are a visual medium, right? And you can tell a story with no words, and I had that Snake Eyes comic. I don't know if you ever saw that. G.I. Joe did a 2-issue, Snake Eyes comic that, where there was no dialogue.
Amazing.
I love that. Yeah, it was awesome.
So. They did 2 more after that first one. On? Yeah, because the first one is Snake Eyes saves Scarlet from Storm Shadow.
Yeah, that's right. Then they're fighting on a bus on the or subway on the cover or something.
And then the like maybe a year or so later, when Storm Shadow's a good guy now, Snake Eyes gets captured. So Storm Shadow and Scarlet go rescue Snake Eyes, and it's also silent. And I'm like, so awesome. Why does no one ever talk about this one?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, because the first one was so groundbreaking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm like, but they should collect all of them.
Yeah. No, it was amazing. And like you asked me earlier about formative stuff. Like one of the earliest comics I read was I was into Swamp Thing. So then I went and I picked up Man Thing. And some of the early Man Things are like super experimental and like so weird, and like you'll have a whole chunk of prose, on one side of the page, and like a poem and all this other weird stuff, right? So like that's when I got kind of hooked on the medium, right? But I was never really worried about Jim's ability as a storyteller. I thought but again, you should ask him about that. I think he put a lot of pressure on himself to deliver there.
Yeah, because I think fans didn't know how it was going to go, because we all loved his run with Greg, and then all of a sudden, one Greg was gone, and 2, I think Jim had said that he wasn't going to use Alice out of respect for Greg, and then 3, it was the New 52, and absolutely nobody knew what to expect. Like, what was that like?
Yeah, that was the hardest part actually about doing the run, was the fact that was all happening at the same time, the New 52 part. That was probably the biggest challenge.
Can you elaborate on that, please?
Oh yeah, so it was interesting because I think when we did our first pitch, and when we wrote our first issue or 2, the New 52, I don't even think had been announced, and we didn't know anything about it. And then we started getting these kind of drips of information about it, and we're like, oh, how is this going to affect things? And at first it was kind of like, well, it's not really going to. And then it was like, oh no, now there's some stuff that's being revised. So like, I think the first issue, we have at the end of I think it's the first issue, there's a conversation between, Kate and Batman on top of a building. And it was the Dick Grayson Batman.
Yeah.
And I loved writing that version of Batman because he's so much like, he's more chill. Like he was funny. Like we had some jokes between. She's like, I don't even know what to call you. Do I call you Batman 2? Do I call you like, so we had a little bit of banter there back and forth, and it was really fun. And it was just a different, it's just a different feeling Batman, right? So it was great to be able to write that. But then we found out, oh no, because of New 52, Dick Grayson's never been Batman, so we had to go back and rewrite it, and Jim had to make some art tweaks, and that was kind of the first of things where we're like, oh, how's this going to pan out? And I think, to DC's credit, I think what they were trying to do was let the individual writers on the books kind of define what was true and what wasn't for a while, but that ended up in some weird complications where it was like, well, like we had this whole, like, we had this running joke that Beth was a member, was in the Teen Titans, right? And so like Kate keeps like ribbing her for that, like, again and again and again. It's like it goes on for like 5 or 6 issues. She mentions, the Teen Titans comes up in some capacity, right? And then we were told, oh no, the creative team on Teen Titans is establishing this is the first and only team so far. So she was never in the Teen Titans. And we're like, well, wait, that like, all those jokes don't make sense, right? So there was just things like that we were kind of wrestling with as we went through it. But in general, because we were telling Batwoman stories, and it was a little bit, they were kind of more four-walled, and kind of weren't interacting with the rest of the universe as much. For the most part, everything was, there weren't a ton of those things, but it was trying to keep up on, oh, what's changing, and that was a little bit hard. And I kind of contrast that with when I worked on when I worked on Master of Kung Fu for DC, Marvel, during the kind of Battle World thing that they were doing. And that was very clear. Like, there was a Bible, there was a, here's who you can use and who you can't use, here are the parameters. And I was like, okay, cool, I'm off to the races. Like, I know exactly what my guardrails are. Whereas with the New 52, we were kind of feeling it out as we went, because everything was kind of evolving at once. And then it ultimately led to, I think, some of the conflicts that we were frustrated with, some stuff we wanted to do with Killer Croc that got nixed because of things that were happening elsewhere in the New 52. And then ultimately the kind of decree that, our superheroes don't get married because
which really meant Batwoman, right?
Well, again, in their defense, I don't know that was, I don't know that it was ever about Batwoman specifically, to be fair, because there were also things like with Aquaman, and his, he's never been married, even though Aquaman had been married for years in the continuity, right? They broke up, I think Lois and Superman, right? So what we were told,
now they're back together.
Yeah, right. So like, again, it's all cyclical, but what we were told was, that there was a feeling that once a couple gets married, all the drama goes out of the relationship. And I was like, Jim and I are both married, and we heard that. We're like, yeah, that's not true. Like,
it would be true of Batman.
Drama. Maybe, right? Maybe depending on who he married, I guess, right? But there's still a ton of drama in the relationship. It's just different, right? And the challenges are different. And you're dealing with a vigilante and a cop who, have day jobs that, night jobs, I guess, right? But and are on different sides of the law in some ways. And like we were really excited about exploring some of those things. And I, again, when you marry into a family, like when you marry somebody, a lot of times you're marrying their family too. So we were excited about dealing with the extended family and the relationships between, Maggie and Kate's dad, which was I loved writing Kate's dad. I that was one of my favorite characters to write. I was really channeling a lot of my feelings about my own kids through him, so it was really disappointing from that standpoint. But I don't, just to set the record straight, I don't know that it was ever malicious or that it was a, anti-LGBTQ thing, right? I think that it was more of, they had this really, firm view that, they didn't want the characters to get married because of kind of their sense that the drama would kind of fade as a result. Our frustration wasn't even necessarily that they had that stance, although I disagreed with it vehemently. It was that we had plotted out, these 24 issues that were going to culminate in, the engagement, right? And we wanted them to get married in the book, and we knew where that was going to happen. And it was the same thing with Croc. We had plotted out a big storyline for Killer Croc and things that were going to happen to him post World's Finest. And again, they knew about that, and it didn't get nixed at the time it was pitched. It got nixed somewhere down the line. And you're like, well, we spent 10 issues setting it up, and now we've got to change everything. And that was a little bit frustrating. So, but it's hard, again, I can only imagine managing however many books, 50 books or whatever it was
52.
at one time. 52, right? Thank you. managing 52 stories all at once is, I'm sure was a super daunting task. So
It's always
I
weird.
don't.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's always weird to have like
Yeah,
such a big blanket statement like that. All superheroes shouldn't get
yeah,
married. All superheroes
yeah,
should be married. Because I'm like,
yeah,
even among fans, I'm like, I
yeah,
prefer Spider-Man single, but I prefer Superman married. But whenever I
yeah,
say
for
one
sure.
of those two things, like
Yeah.
the other fans are like, oh, you prefer Spider-Man single, so you must prefer Superman single. I'm like, no, like,
No, it's all about the characters. I mean, I think like, and you got to look at who they are and how old they are and where they're at in their lives and all that stuff, right? And I think it's just, again, I always saw it because just growing up, like again, as I was growing up, one of my favorite superhero books was the Justice League, and it was kind of the Watchtower era, when they're all on the satellite, right? And you had the different cast of characters coming in, and they're all different ages, and they're all at different points in their life and stuff. And like, this is probably not a very popular statement, but I loved Aquaman. I always thought Aquaman was cool, but Aquaman's the king, right? He's the guy that should be married, right? He should have a family. He should be like, he should be dealing with those types of problems while he's also trying to save the world, right? And like, but that's very different than Spider-Man. You want Spider-Man to be that freewheeling 20 something who's trying to make ends meet, like that's for me that was
yeah,
the perfect Spider-Man too, right? So I agree with you that like I think Superman was better married too, and Spider-Man is better single, but even there, single doesn't necessarily mean not like
yeah,
when he had drama with Mary Jane, sometimes that could be interesting too, because it's like he's balancing those,
yeah.
those his relationship to Spider-Man and his relationship to Mary Jane.
I like Spider-Man single because I like it when he dates women that are bad for him
Mm-hmm.
because he
Like
would.
Black Cat,
Like
yeah,
especially Black Cat, because it's like,
yeah,
oh yeah, they're so bad for each other. This is
yeah,
entertaining. The entertainment
yeah,
factor is like, and meanwhile, like Superman is like, who else is he gonna date?
yeah.
Everyone knows
Well,
it's a fake out.
yeah, Wonder Woman. That would be the other one. But although I loved it when they had, I can't remember the name. There was the graphic novel I think played around with a lot. But the Batman Wonder Woman romance I always thought was perfect. I thought that they should have played with that more. But I'll tell you, like, where some of those relationships work sometimes too for me. Like Craven's Last Hunt is another
Yeah,
real favorite of mine. I love that. That 6-issue run. But one of the things that's really powerful in that is Mary Jane's reaction to Peter having been gone for a while, right? And so in a way, it's like I think when you can take those characters and they do this with Lois pretty well a lot of times, but when you make those characters more than just set dressing, right? And it's not, and you have those moments where it's not just about Spider-Man's relationship to Mary Jane and his feelings towards her, but her feelings towards him, and that I thought was really powerful. Like, oh God, yeah, dating a superhero has got to be really rough. Like when he vanishes for weeks at a time, and Craven's out there running around as Spider-Man killing people or whatever. You're like, Jesus, what kind of weird psychological trauma do you go through because of that? And we wanted to play around with that with not to that degree because she's a different character, but with Maggie and Kate.
yeah,
And show how Maggie wrestles with the fact that Kate's is that one.
yeah. Because that was the interesting thing too when you guys were using Maggie, because Maggie's, but this is the wrong word for it. Maggie's basically a coworker.
Yeah, Brett.
With
Well,
Kate.
so we set it up originally. Our original part of the pitch was we're like, we want Maggie to be the anti-Gordon. So if Gordon is kind of an ally to Batman, right? Even though he knows Batman's breaking the law, Maggie's like not like she's the antithesis of that in a way, right? Because she doesn't know Kate's Batwoman yet, right? And so so she's actually like, no, Batwoman's not helping us. She's not doing it. She's not making things easier for us, right? And then over time, obviously, especially once she realizes who she is, then that obviously has to change, right? And we wanted to really play with that dynamic a lot and show Maggie wrestling with that, because there's that moment in one of the issues where Batwoman accidentally stabs Maggie with the hypodermic that's got one of Scarecrow's kind of fear things in it or whatever, and she ends up trapped in this kind of nightmare world for a bit, right? And so, and we were going to have that come up a little bit later, something that Maggie was still wrestling with, that like, I love you, but this thing that happened between us, we have to face,
Yeah. JH tells me a story about a signing that he was at. And then an LGBT woman comes up to him and says that Batwoman was so important to her. And then that's when he realized that you guys had to push through with the engagement issue. What are your memories on that particular moment?
So for me, the moment that was almost more formative was I aunts who are lesbians and married couple, and giving them that woman and telling them where the story was going, and having them basically acknowledge that it made them feel seen's not the right word, right? But that to know that their relationship, because they had just gotten married, that their relationship could be something that could be modeled in a in a comic book was really meaningful, right? And that media was changing and evolving, right? So I think from that standpoint, and then when we won the GLAAD award after the first run, I was like, oh, okay, well, we gotta we have to live up to this, and we have to keep pushing. So I think it was, and we got constant validation. I mean, from people that we know. I mean, I'm fortunate, I live in the Bay Area, and it's a pretty progressive area of California, and so I'm surrounded by folks from that community, and again, very close relatives. So being able to get that validation constantly as we were writing the book, I think was really helpful. But each time then ratcheted up, like, oh, the pressure of like, well, we gotta make sure that we don't screw this up. And and so the engagement for us became kind of a North Star. Like, we wanted to work towards that and show it. But again, the other thing for me that was really important, and hopefully this is why I think it resonated, and I had this conversation with Jim early on. I said, I don't want to sign up to do the book unless we agree that and we make sure DC is on the same page, that we're not putting anybody on a pedestal, right? That like the only thing that will make Kate human is if she feels like she has to have flaws. That's what makes us human. We all have flaws. And so, from my standpoint, she was kind of rash and
temperamental
and
yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so and like, again, even the thing where she accidentally stabs Maggie, like that all comes about from her, kind of almost, I don't know, there's this being out over her skis a little bit, right? And kind of taking on a little bit more than maybe she can handle, but being overconfident and cocky and thinking that she can do it, right? So so that was important to me, because that was the way that I connected with her, is like, well, what are the, I need to have somebody that has flaws that are similar to mine, I guess. So that I can write her and be, because I'm not a woman, I'm not Jewish, I'm not a lesbian, right? So what are the things that I can do to humanize her, that hopefully will resonate? That was important to me.
And very quickly, what was it like working with Mike Del Mundo on Elektra?
Mike was amazing. So I feel so fortunate to have, like, so you said earlier that thing that, oh, Jim's a real artist. Like I feel that about Mike. Like, I have such respect for that guy. And I don't think that, like with Jim, I don't think there was a single panel that he didn't surprise me and do something amazing with. And one of my great regrets is that book's going to go for longer, right? I mean, I think that could have been a 100 issue series, with the way that we wanted to take, the direction we want to go with the story, and the team that we were trying to basically build a team around Elektra and give her kind of a bigger role, and not have her just be this assassin that came out of the shadow, but put her into a kind of a new role so that we could stretch her and do some things that maybe we hadn't seen before. But he was so great to work with, because one of the very first things we sat down, I was like, well, what do you want to draw? I want to draw monsters. Okay, let's send Elektra to Monster Island, right? Like, cool. Like that's never been done before. And how is Elektra gonna, deal with Elektra, with Monster Island? And then I got to throw in all my favorite characters. Like, I like some of the weird side characters, right? So I Scalp Hunter, his name notwithstanding, but was a favorite kind of mutant of mine when I was growing up and reading the Mutant Massacre. I just thought he was kind of a cool character. And Lady Bullseye, I always loved the design there. And we have Sabretooth show up briefly, right? So like, it just was super fun to be able to throw all that stuff together. And he was game for like anything. It was like, hey, what happened? What if we do like a whole segment where she's riding a dragon? He's like, yeah, let's do that. It's just, there was never, like, he was just so excited and passionate about everything. And then again, if you look at his work, it's incredible. Yeah. And he's the one of my favorite pieces in that whole thing is the opening of the first issue where she's dancing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Doing that kind of ballet dance. And then you realize, oh no, she's killing a bunch of people as she goes, and she's just kind of in her head with that dance. And that all came from an early, before there was even a story, there was a cover that Mike had done that had a cover image and they were, when Marvel asked me to write it, they're like, hey, here's one of like kind of teaser images we have. And I was like, oh, that's going to become that's the first scene of the book is that, that image, right, of her, kind of combining the ballet with the bloodletting, So yeah, he was just, I mean, talk about a guy too, that like, I never wanted to let down and I wanted to write for it. It's the same with Jim, right? It's like every issue I was trying to outdo myself because I wanted Mike to go, oh, I can't wait to draw this,
Is it insane
always
that
the
the
best,
two comic artists that you're most associated with are J.H. Williams III and Mike Del Mundo?
I'm so lucky. I mean, and I've worked with some really great people too over the years. Like Brian Shane was awesome. I worked with him on some Star Wars stuff. He was amazing, right? So Jan Jaresma, I'm sure I butchered her last name. She did one of my very first stories. And actually, my first collaboration with Jim, which I totally forgot about, was that I'd done a comic book. So Dark Horse was trying to basically do some crossovers between comics and games, because rightfully so, they're looking at it going, well, games sell, 10 times what a comic book sells, right? So if we can go out and we get some of the gamers interested in buying these comics, then, we can increase our sales. So they asked me if I wanted to do a tie-in to a game that had come out called Starfighter. And I'd written for that game, and I had created this character named Nim, who was this big, alien pirate. And I love that character. I was like, yeah, let me do I did a short story, Dark Horse or Star Wars Tales. And then we ended up doing a 3-issue limited series called Crossbones. And JH did the covers for all those, right? So that was my first collaboration with him, which I was like, oh, awesome, So I've been pretty fortunate all along the way to work with some really great artists who, hopefully have taken my scripts with kind of a grain of salt and gone off and done even better things than I could have imagined with them, right? So every idea that the artists that I work with have come up with has always been better than whatever I put in the description.
Is it safe to say that you might not have done Elektra if Jim hadn't been offered Sandman Overture? Because you were already working on Echolands, right? And then he was offered Sandman, and then
so that was interesting too. So we were really close. I think that was another one where I think we maybe had even already agreed that we were going to do it with Image by that point. And we were talking to a couple different publishers, and I think that we had finally settled on Image. And then he got Sandman, and he called me, and he's like, "Oh, I'm really torn. Like, what do I do?" And I really want to do Echolands, but I got Sandman. I was like, Jim, you have to do it. Like, you have to. Like, it's Sandman, and it's Neil Gaiman. Like, I mean, talk about being fortunate to work with, Mike and Jim. Jim's list of writers that he's been able to work with is incredible, right? I mean,
Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, right. I mean, he's got the triumvirate there, right? So I think that and he's learned a lot from them, and then I've learned from them by osmosis, which has been fantastic for me. So I'm really glad he went and he did that, even though it delayed us working on Echolands. I don't know that I wouldn't have done. I mean, I think I still would have done Elektra because for me, I'm fortunate, right? I can write a book faster than Jim can draw. So, which is true, I think, of any, again, if I was a full-time comic book writer, I could probably write 5 or 6 comics a month, and hopefully deliver that. You look at guys like, what is Charlie Soule, who I think he writes 25 comics a month or something, right? I mean, there's guys out there that just
Tom Taylor
are capable of doing that. Yeah,
Tom
right.
Taylor's writing everything,
and like every day, it seems like they're announcing something new, right? So so I think I probably would have still done Elektra even if we were working on Echolands. But I was really fortunate to have that run of Batwoman, Elektra, Master of Kung Fu, all kind of right back to back. I think was I really enjoyed that.
How did it feel when Echolands finally came out last year?
Oh, it was such a huge relief. I mean, it almost wasn't like real, right? Like it just had been so long, and I hate to admit this, but like I don't usually read, because I read the comics so many times before they arrive in my hands, right? So I don't always read the contributor copies that I get of the comics that I've written, because I'm usually off to the next thing. But with this, I sat and I poured over every panel and read, every line again, and reread it, 3 or 4 times, because it felt like, oh my God, it's finally real. So, and to be able to hand it to people, be like, I gave it to my kids, who immediately flipped to the head exploding page. But to be able to say, this is what I've been working on for years, was fantastic. And then the reception, I can't believe some of the quotes we got, like some of the folks that read it and liked it, and just, I was so humbled by that. So that, that all felt really good. So I just, I just hope we get to continue doing it. It's,
Yeah.
I think we could write hundreds of issues of it if we, wanted to.
How did, so here's an interesting thing. How did you and Jim hammer in everything? Like, figure out the world, the setup of the world.
Yeah. So going back, I'll probably be really long-winded here, so hopefully you can edit
It's
around
fine.
it. But the very first conversation we had, I can still remember I was on a wireless phone, not even a cell phone, walking around my living room, as Jim said, "Hey, I have this idea." And at the time, he had three parts of the idea, if I recall correctly. One, he's like, I had this image as a kid of this, girl in red, right? And, I'm a woman in red now, right? But this, kind of girl with a red hood and a red cape. And I know she's a thief. And there was a couple other details I think he knew about her, right? And he's like, and she's stolen a gem from a wizard who's hunting her, right? And that was kind of the basic, like what he knew. And then he told me kind of and it's in a world that has this kind of backstory, right? That there's this, again, which we haven't really revealed yet, right? So Jim kind of told me about the world, the idea behind the world. And I was like, oh, that was the thing for me. I was like, yes, we can, like, because again, I think even that time I was still at LucasArts, right? And like the promise of Star Wars isn't that it's a story about Luke. It's the promise of Star Wars is the universe that supports endless stories, right? And that's Harry Potter's kind of the same way, right? The Harry Potter universe, yes, the books are about Harry Potter, but that's a universe that theoretically supports endless stories. There's a richness to it and kind of a hidden history and all these other things. So, so I kind of, we got excited about I got excited about the world. Then over the course of the next, several months, we started fleshing out the cast and the plot. And initially it was like, oh, it'll be a 12-issue series. And then as we started working on it, we're like, well, we probably, we want to add this and we want to add that, and it grew to kind of 24 issues. And then I broke it down because I'm a little bit analytical sometimes with story breakdowns, especially with comics, because I'm cognizant of the page count, right, and the panel count, and I want to make sure that everything fits and we don't feel like we're cramming too much in or we're leaving things out or we're rushing things or whatever. So I actually, Jim kind of asked me about this, but I took the whole story and broke it down into put it in an Excel spreadsheet and broke it down by issue and page and then even got down to kind of the panel count, all of which goes out the window the minute we start writing the actual script. But at least we know, okay, this is what we kind of have to start with, and that we use that for kind of the first couple of issues, and then since then we've been a little bit more freeform. But it was just a lot of back and forth in the early days about the plot and the big beats and the characters and who was driving what part of the story in terms of the character standpoint. And then when we get to the scripting, usually it'll be one of us will take a quick run at a first draft, and it all depends on usually kind of our schedules and who's busy doing what. If I'm in crunch on a milestone for the games, or then he might take a pass, or if he's trying to finish up a cover or whatever, I might take a pass. And it'll be a little bit different depending on who takes the pass, right? You can imagine if Jim does it, there's a lot of like, hey, I want the action to flow this way, and I think here's some panel design that I'm thinking of, and these are the kind of story beats I think we can fit in here, and then here's a big section that I don't know what to do with, and we'll fill that in. And for me, it's more like I have this cool exchange I want to have between Core and Hope, and I want them to say these things to each other. And I don't, we just, which I think makes us good collaborators. We just think about things on slightly different levels. Then we just pass that back and forth a bunch. We'll do 8 or 9 drafts, passing it back and forth before we're happy, and then we'll get on a call. Usually we get on a call after the first or second draft just to be like, okay, there's a couple things that like either we're both way off on, like I really like, I didn't think we were going this direction, so let's make sure we hash it out, or I have this other idea I want to pitch, or like here's a scene that we know needs to happen but we have no idea how to make it work or where to set it yet, so like let's hash out some of that stuff. So we'll get together and hash some things out after the first or second draft. Then it goes back and forth a bunch of times, and then we get together at the end to basically talk through the final like passive dialogue. And anything that, we want to change it at that level before we kind of do it. And then I'll do like usually kind of just a final typo, looking for grammar and typo issues, right, or whatever. But it's really like this really fascinating thing. It's been exciting is just watching and Jim, I'm sure, has talked about this, right? Like when we started issue 1, I don't even think we had names for any of the other characters outside of Hope, Core, Romulus, and Rabbit. Like I don't remember. Like we hadn't named Rosa, I don't think yet. We hadn't come up with Dina as a character. I don't think we had named Castrum, right? So like it was kind of like, and we didn't know who any of them there were, so we kind of invented them after, mostly in issue 2, because that's when they really kind of come to the fore. And it was like, oh, we had this vampire in the background, let's throw her in and make her one of the main characters. And then those characters have taken a life of their own, right? And like, Rabbit was supposed to die in when they get attacked by the serpent, so when the end of issue 2, beginning of issue 3, he's supposed to be dead, and that was supposed to be something that hangs over for the rest of the day. And we're like, yeah, we like Rabbit too much, let's have him survive, and Hope will think he's dead, but eventually she'll find out he's not. But like they'll blame, Rosa will blame her for Rabbit's death because he's still gone, but like let's have him wash up on on an island somewhere. And so but it's just, again,
the best island, the best island,
right? I love that. That's also what, like the collective of what, one of my favorite bits in that whole thing is this idea that these robots are like, we realize that if we know too much about organics, we're just going to kill them someday. So we can't know too much about organics. You have to leave, right? Like, I love that little bit in that issue.
Yeah, I love that too, because and I asked Jim this, and I don't know if you'll answer it because he didn't.
Well, that's good to know.
The robots on Metamaru Mountain, they do say that exact same thing. Are things in Echolands destined to happen?
From my point of view, this is not a story. So there is a big theme to the story. And we actually started, it was interesting because when we wrote our initial pitch document, that was one of the very first paragraphs, was talking about the theme of the story, right? And I believe that every good story needs a good, strong kind of central theme that you can kind of debate as you go through the story. So there is a theme to the story, and it's not destiny, and it's not, whether or not you can shake off the shackles of destiny, or are you destined to, become good or evil, or those types of things. We do obviously play around with the idea, and certainly they're on a freight train towards something, which is alluded to, I don't think is giving anything away. The opening 2 pages of every issue, or page and a half or whatever of every issue, is, takes place at a different point in time than the main story takes place, right?
In the future, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually in the future, right? So they're moving towards that moment in time. So from that standpoint, they're destined to reach that point in time. But I think that there's going to be a lot of surprises along the way, and how they get there and why they're there, and the relationships between the characters once they're there are all going to be hopefully surprising to the reader.
Do all of those initial pages, opening pages, do they all take place at the same point in time?
I don't know if Jim will get mad at me if I answer that.
You don't have to answer it.
I'm not going to plead the fifth on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I feel like you have answered it though by not answering.
No, I don't know. I mean, maybe not. Yeah. And again, we're still kind of discovering as we go too, right? It's funny because we'll be like, I didn't know that, this character was still going to be around at that moment in time, right? So we're, but we just showed him in the scene, so I guess he will be, right? So, there's that cliche that like the characters will tell you where the story needs to go, or the story will tell you where the story needs to go, and that's actually, it's happening for us as we write it, which is really interesting.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, right, it was just supposed to be Hope and Core. Rabbit was supposed to die.
Yeah, the core. We always knew there was going to be a supporting cast. We didn't really know how important they were going to be yet, and our focus, especially when it was shorter series, our focus was on the kind of triumvirate of Core, Romulus, and Hope, right?
Yeah.
So we knew those were going to be our big 3, and they were going to kind of be the main characters from a protagonist standpoint, right? And then we had Rabbit as kind of a minor character that again was going to perish in that second issue, and we have the Wizard. We had him from day one. And then somewhere along the way, we added Iris, which was, I mean, she's been there since very early on, but we knew we wanted to give him kind of a right hand. So we came up with this idea, this kind of unstoppable golem that's built from all these artifacts and parts. And then somewhere along the way, we're like, well, he just treats her like his daughter because he made her,
Made her,
made her in a lab somewhere. Yeah. So those were always our kind of our big five, right? With, Core, Romulus, Hope, Iris, and the Wizard. Who didn't have a name for the longest time, I don't think, until we got closer to plotting out the individual issues. Yeah.
Terros Demande.
Yeah, Terros Demande. Yeah.
Yeah, because speaking of things getting away from you, I would argue that the most captivating dynamic in the book so far has been the one between Hope and Rosa.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love that. I love writing Rosa. She's one of my favorite characters, right? So, and again, as a Universal Monster fan, I think it's really evident why, right? So we've been playing around with that a lot, and we're there's some stuff that happens in the next arc that kind of changes that. It continues to allow that dynamic to evolve, right? So we're and hopefully it doesn't feel one note. Like there was a lot of tension between them early on because of everything that happened, but then once they start to realize what they need to do, and they see logic in each other's, they start to see each other's point of view. So the relationship starts to evolve a little bit, but hopefully doesn't ever lose that edge.
Yeah, but then there's that ending to number 6. So as a video game designer, how did you approach the world building of Echolands?
So like a video game designer, actually. So even just a game designer. So again, you can add to my geek cred. Maybe growing up, I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and other pen and paper role playing games. Was probably not surprising, right? But my favorite thing to do actually was I collected role playing games for a really long time, and only ever played a handful of them. We played a ton of Dungeons and Dragons and a handful of others, but I consumed them all. One, because I like to understand the systems, and I always thought the systems were interesting, but also to understand the worlds, right? So the source books for the worlds were always really fascinating to me. So I kind of approached it as kind of a source book, from a source book mentality, right? And provide way more information than we're ever going to expose to the reader. So the initial pitch, we included a bunch of kind of vague references. I think we named some things, like we named Meteor Mountain in the pitch, but we never described what it was. We just said we might have said that it was a region, kind of populated by robots, right? But then that evolved into, okay, we have to actually start defining some of this stuff. So I really approach it like writing a world Bible. So we have there's a program called Scrivener, which is a kind of a binder program that I use, and I've got a Bible that every single character, event, object, location, anything that we have reference is in there, and we describe it. We put notes in there for what we wanted to do with in the future, what has been revealed and what hasn't been revealed. So I maintain that Bible, which is, when we're done with an issue, is quite a bit of work to go back in and update the Bible, right? Because there's just so much packed into every issue, which is, again, what you would expect if you were doing a big, video game RPG. Then the other thing I think that's really important to games, and Jim and I have never actually had to talk about this because he does it naturally, but you want the world to tell a story too, like just by looking at it, right? So there needs to be that kind of history to the world, and it has to feel like it's been there for a while and it's lived in, and you can look for clues to the past and things in the world, right? And Jim just does that naturally, right? There's very few instances where I even have to call something out and say, hey, let's put something here to kind of remind the reader that the world has this history to it, right? But that that's another thing that we have to be really cognizant of in games.
Well, that sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah, but it's super fun. I mean, it's what, honestly, and I can't remember who it was. There was a writer, there's a horror writer, and I can't remember now. I'm gonna blank on his name. But somebody was talking about world building and using Scrivener, actually, and it's the most fun way to procrastinate, which is true, right? Like I'll go, I gotta work on the new issue, but I'm gonna spend 2 hours updating the Bible, because it's like there's no pressure. Nobody's ever going to see it, probably except me or Jim, unless we decide to do, the Marvel Handbook someday, right?
Yeah.
Which I copied the format of for this Bible. So there's a whole entry on Hope that reads like, the Marvel Handbook. But it's super fun,
Wait,
right?
known affiliations. Yeah.
Totally. All that stuff. I got a ton of that stuff in there, right? And it's really interesting too, because it's been really useful, because I'll put some stuff in there. I'll be like, I think we've revealed this, or I think we've agreed to this, or whatever. And then Jim will read it and be like, wait, where did that come from? And I was like, oh yeah, maybe I just made that up right now, right? Like, do you like it? Okay, yeah, let's keep it. So we use it to kind of flesh some stuff out, but it's a ton. I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's super fun, because there's no pressure. I'm just taking the stuff that we've already done and like, putting in some prose and kind of making sure that it's been kind of codified or memorialized somehow, right? But if there's ever a spin-off, or we ever turn around and make a game or do something like that, it'll be, we'll have this Bible to start with.
I will ask about possibly making a game later.
Yeah. All right.
What is it like working on Echolands, and every time you see a page from Jim come in?
It is both frustrating and exciting all at once, because it's frustrating from the standpoint of like, I look at the art and I'm like, oh man, I don't know if the words are doing it justice, right? Like, it's always so amazing from that standpoint. It does, because of the way Jim works, I usually see things, like he's funny. He'll text me sometimes updates where he'll just take a photo of what he's working on and he'll text it to me, right? And that's always super exciting, and that gets me, re-engaged. Sometimes I'll go weeks without, working on Echolands, just because again, he's working on the art, right? And we're not ready to start the next issue yet.
Yeah, I hear number 7's taking a while.
Yeah, because there's a lot of Horror Hill stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's been really, I think it's really interesting too, like putting my kind of producer hat on from a game standpoint. We're learning a lot, right? So like when you build a game, especially if it's a type of game you haven't done before, or you're building it for new hardware, or you're using new tools, you don't always know how long things are going to take, right? So you might have a rough ballpark idea. It's going to take us X amount of time to build a character. You don't really know until you build the character, and so you're constantly reacting on the fly, like, oh, okay, it's taking us, whatever, 25% longer to build a character than we thought to the level of quality that we want. So what does that mean? Are we going to hire more character artists? Or are we going to cut 25% of the characters? Like, what are we going to do? And I think we're kind of learning that as Jim goes along, like, oh, some of these things just take a lot longer. So I don't know what that means for us down the line, but it'll probably mean like, well, we're going to be, when we go back to Horror Hill, we're going to be really careful about, how many panels it is, or where it's all going to be set in a big gray plane somewhere, instead of inside a castle, but it's important to know that stuff, right? I mean, it's important to take that stuff into account when you're, if you're writing for an artist, right? Obviously, Jim is writing for himself. So.
Obviously, he has done jam pieces before where he draws in multiple styles, but like this is it, right? Like,
oh my God, yeah.
How do you feel about this? Does it even feel like it's one artist working on this thing when you see it?
It does, because for me it does, because I can see his personality coming through in everything that he does, and so so from that standpoint, I mean, it's not that I'm not constantly surprised and amazed by what he's done, right? And I think that when he does some of the painting too, like himself, I think that that stuff's all fantastic, right? So I think from that standpoint, I mean, Dave's amazing, right? So like, that it's hard not to, and that's the thing too, is like, and I said this earlier, one of the things I really love about working on comics is it is this kind of this really tight collaboration. And when you have a team that works well together and kind of gets what you're doing, it just like clicks and flows, right? So like, we can describe, hey, we want, I mean, even like we put a lot of thought into like what the dialogue bubble should look like for the different characters, but we don't have to describe it very well, and Todd will go in and do something that we're like, well, shit, that, that's perfect, right? So can I cut? I didn't even ask if I could cut.
No, yeah, okay.
Yeah, all right. So he'll be like, so I think from that standpoint, there's
no people below 13 listen to the show.
All right, good, awesome. So yeah, so there's, one of my kids hear it all the time, but I think that there's just a shorthand that develops over time when you're working in these kind of collaborative environments. So nothing, I'll say it this way, I'm constantly surprised when I see Jim's work, because it just is like, oh wow, that's, even more amazing or so different than what I imagined, right? But I'm never shocked, right? It's never like, oh my God, how did he do that? You're like, well, of course he can do that. Look at everything else he's done, right? So
It's like, oh my God, so good.
yeah, right. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
just feel really, again, I think fortunate that we're able to play in this world and he's bringing it to life in such a dramatic way.
And again, Dave Stewart, one of the greatest colorists who ever
Yeah,
lived.
yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, and there again, it's like, and to be able to take the ideas of like, well, let's make this, this character's a little flat, right? Because we want to, we capture this specific art style, and this character needs to look more like a wash. And I mean, so they're both changing up their art styles as they, work through the book too.
Yeah, putting Rosa up against Romulus, for example,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
Castrum, which is amazing. And of course, Todd Klein.
Yeah, I mean, again, the whole crew. I feel really fortunate that everybody's part of it. Yeah.
I'm gonna go through a bunch of the characters, and if you could give me like a one-word description, a one-sentence description that could go into their character profiles, that'd be great.
I almost want to like bring up the bio because I think I literally wrote those. So yeah, go ahead. Try me.
Yeah.
Without,
So like let's just imagine, for example, that the people watching this particular segment have not read the book and they just want a quick primer. Okay. Hope Red Hood.
Impulsive thief. Well, again, that's only one part of it, though, right? I would say, impulsive thief to strong-willed leader, right, is really kind of the two aspects of her that hopefully you've already started to see glimpses of,
So you're
super fun, right?
You're not going to mention the fact that she can blow things up randomly.
Oh, okay. Well, if you want me to go into that, I mean, if you want me to give like the elevator pitch, yeah. I mean, she's an impulsive thief that has, an uncontrolled power that allows her to, cause people's heads to explode. And she's trying to get, she's wrestling with that.
What about Core?
So Core's a biker Hun, which was the very first description we ever wrote of him, which I was like, that's just brilliant. I love that idea. From a character standpoint, I always think of Core as, in a way, he's kind of at the conscience of the group right now, and he's not soft. I mean, he's a madman, and he's been in fights, and he's got a history there, and he's definitely killed people, right? I mean, there's things that he's done in the past, but he's got a heart too, right? So he's in some ways he's kind of he's an emotional anchor for me, at least when I'm writing a lot of the scenes with him.
And of course, they're from different places,
They're from different places, yeah.
Mythwood.
Yep.
Which is like, how did you react to this when JH basically said, here's a character, she's basically grown up Little Red Riding Hood. Yeah.
Well, it all works with the fiction of the world, a lot of it will end up kind of working. So because I knew that from the get-go, for me, it wasn't very jarring. The interesting part about it was I don't know that I even fixated on the Little Red Riding Hood aspect of it ever. For me, it was more about the thief and the Robin Hood feel to it.
Yeah.
I was a kid. I loved the Disney Robin Hood when I was a kid. So that's one of my favorite Disney movies. So there was that aspect of it, and the fact that her choice, her decision, kind of puts all these other characters on the run, I thought was really compelling. And then her power, right? Like which we didn't know, and it was funny because Jim may have had this in his head. This would be a good question to ask him. He may have known in his head what the power actually did, but all we really described it as in all the kind of pitch documents and the kind of plot outlines was, is this kind of power that she can't control, and that causes kind of death and destruction around her, right? But we didn't really know, or I didn't know at least exactly what it was going to be until we wrote that first issue. And I was like, oh, that's where we're going with it. Cool.
What about Iris?
Iris is an unstoppable assassin. She's an enchanted golem who becomes an unstoppable assassin, and is our antagonist, the wizard's daughter. So there's some, I think, interesting dynamics from a kind of dramatic tension there, I think, with their relationship. But at her core, she is this unstoppable assassin who is built from kind of the pieces and parts other kind of, both kind of techno magical and kind of enchanted artifacts and other pieces from around kind of the Echolands that Taros has collected, which I think makes her super interesting, right? So she's got, this kind of magical sword element to her, and she's got the technological eye she can detach that can hunt down, Hope based on her, kind of trace samples of DNA. And so she combines genres in a really, really interesting way. But if you need the elevator pitch, she's the wizard's unstoppable golem.
And Rosa. It's your favorite character?
Rosa, maybe I think after Hope, she might, well, I don't know. It's hard to say. It's like picking, that cliche of you got to ask me to pick my favorite kids, right? Like again, we talk about him later. There was a scene that one of my favorite scenes that I, wrote that doesn't deal with any of those characters. So Rosa is a vampire in the Echolands. She has been cast out from Horror Hill, which is kind of the vampire kingdom where, vampires live, and has been forced to become a thief. And I don't want to give anything away if you haven't read the first 6 issues, but there's big revelations about her by the end of the 6th issue. But yeah, she's a kind of strong-willed and protective of her friends, vampire thief.
What about Castrum?
So Castrum's character, I would say that like one of my favorite scenes that we wrote was the scene between Castrum and Dina.
It's a beautiful
Castrum
scene.
Where he's, kind of revealing some of his, vulnerabilities, and she's revealing some of hers, or they are revealing some of theirs. So Castrum is a gangster from old Chicago. He has been forced on the run both because of some gang warfare and some crimes that he committed in old Chicago. So he's found himself in kind of the our version of San Francisco, and also has become a thief. As a gangster, he is kind of he's a guy that has enjoyed the high life in the past, and I think probably dreams of getting back there. But right now is just trying to survive, and he ends up he's dealt a pretty rough hand early on in the series that he's going to have to deal with for the rest of the series.
Dina. Yeah.
So Dina is the easiest way to describe Dina is they are a cyborg elf. They have, some of the kind of traditional characteristics of an elf. So, they have kind of pointed ears and kind of tall and thin and strong. But they have also been augmented with cybernetic parts over the years, to the point where they feel, almost more machine, emotionally they feel this way, more machine than elf. Dina also, like some of the other characters, was forced to become a thief because of things that happened in their backstory and their, kind of kingdom that they are from. And there's some, hints that they might also be kind of on the run or in hiding from another, threat as well that will hopefully surface at some point in the future. Again, if we're going through like the Marvel Handbook version, they're incredibly strong. They've got some cybernetic implants that help them, do things that the other characters can't. And they've got a close relationship with both Castrum and Rosa that we're kind of exploring as we go.
Dina is an amazing character to look at because like it's mostly Mobius, and then all of a sudden that arm is not.
Right.
Rabbit.
Ill-fated Rabbit. So
Too
Rabbit
cool
is a
to die.
Yeah. Rabbit's a young thief who was born with some kind of visible mutations on him, which you see he's got these kind of scales, which has made him a little bit of an outcast. He is orphaned at a young age, which is similar to Hope. So they kind of bond over that. But he's been forced to become a thief since childhood because he's lived this kind of hard scrabble life and is trying to survive. He is technically inclined. He's able to communicate with robots in our world, for example, in a way that some of the other characters can't. He's kind of inventive. He's kind of a tinkerer. Very positive and upbeat and optimistic character for the most part. And despite kind of his kind of harsh upbringing and the fact that he's been a thief, he's kind of innocent in kind of his own way. So and he's off. He originally starts in Hope's band, but ends up kind of spinning off into his own adventure that we get to follow for a while and kind of see some other areas of the Echolands through his kind of awe-inspired, or sorry, his kind of, awestruck eyes.
What about Ryoshin?
So he's a large robot that Rabbit ends up encountering, saves Rabbit essentially when Rabbit kind of washes up on shore of Meadow Mountain, and volunteers to take Rabbit kind of back to his friends, which again, there's kind of a poignant moment there too. Another moment that I like in the story where leaving means giving up ever coming back because of some of the kind of rules and regulations and doctrine and dogma that the robots kind of follow. That they have this belief that if they know too much about organics, they'll eventually someday evolve to wipe them all out. So they're trying to keep themselves from knowing too much. So if he goes out into the world and learns about organics, he can't ever come back because they're worried he'll infect their kind of hermetically sealed kind of knowledge base.
What about the wizard Teros Demond?
Teros Demond is a man after knowledge. So he is we call him the wizard because he's mastered magic in the world. Magic does exist in this world, and he's one of the few people that has some kind of control over it. And he's using that to gain kind of power and authority and governance over huge swaths of the world. But he's really driven by knowledge. He's, controlling the world is almost a means to an end. It's to allow him to kind of be able to throw open the gates to the hidden libraries of the world, and find whatever artifacts he needs to in order to figure out kind of the history of the world and why he's the way he is and why magic exists and all these other kind of secrets and mysteries that he's searching for. But he's ruthless. He's cruel in some regards. There's he doesn't value life beyond, kind of his own and those close to him. And he'll do anything to get back a gem that Hope has stolen from him because he thinks that it ties directly into some of these questions about the world's history.
How do you think the wizard Teros Demond lands, in terms of resonance in today's day and age compared to if you had released Echolands maybe 6 years ago or something?
That's really interesting. It's funny because I mentioned, Abercrombie earlier and kind of as a fantasy writer, and he's got a new book out called The Wisdom of Crowds, which feels very, very timely and is a lot about kind of mob mentality and the dangers of letting, kind of that take hold, right? And it shows the different sides of both elite rule and kind of mob rule, and the kind of pitfalls of both. And I don't know, I keep asking myself, like, did he write that with everything going on in the world in mind, right? And I'm sure it was the backdrop. We've been working on Echolands for so long. I don't think, when we first came up with Teros, there, it wasn't based on any kind of archetype or it wasn't based on any kind of, kind of political events or, kind of current events or anything like that. It was just, hey, we want to tell a cool story. And we've got this idea for this wizard who's seeking knowledge, and he's going to run afoul of Hope because she's going to steal a gem that's important to him. And even though it seems like a small bauble, it's actually really meaningful. And that's going to set our adventure on its path. As we've been writing him, I'm sure we've been influenced by everything that happens in the world, and it's been happening over the last couple of years. But we don't do it consciously. So I don't know. To be honest, I don't know how he lands. And if people look at him, and go, oh, well, he's an allegory for this real life person or whatever. And I do think he's different because the thing for us, Jim and I were just talking about this the other day with somebody else. But the thing that motivates him is his quest for knowledge, right? Which is at the end of the day, it's kind of an altruistic, aspirational. Like, we all like knowledge, right? We all want to seek knowledge, right? It's just he'll do anything to get it, and he sees amassing power as a way to open those doors, and allow him to get to knowledge that may be hidden otherwise. And I don't know that maps to figures
To
today.
certain
Like
people.
I can't. Again, I can't. I don't think Trump's not after knowledge, right? Like that.
No.
He's he's decidedly anti-knowledge. That, like, so as an example, I don't feel like we're modeling after that. And I'd like to think that people look at him. There's that cliche that every good villain is a hero in their own story. I don't know how that applies to somebody like the Joker, who's an amazing villain, right? But it does apply to a lot of other villains. Magneto is always a hero in his own story, in his own head, right?
Yeah.
And I think we kind of view that with Taros too, that he's, the ends justify the means for him. He's very much, he thinks he's doing the right thing by him and the world. He doesn't see himself as evil. But when you watch some of the things you do, he's like, well, yeah, clearly that guy, like, I mean, he's not a moral man.
What about Romulus? Because that's Jim doing Kirby. And
yeah, so the trick, so Romulus is in a weird way, and this is going to be maybe hard to grok initially. Romulus is my tribute to Lando Calrissian, who is maybe my favorite character in all of I know, right? In all of Star Wars. Romulus is a pirate who has taken over a treasure island, which has become kind of a haven for pirates and scoundrels and thieves and whatnot, right? And he rules that with kind of an iron fist. So it's almost like we've taken elements of Pleasure Island from like Pinocchio and crammed it together with pirates and whatnot, right? And Romulus kind of rules that with kind of an iron fist. So in a way, again, the Han Solo element, the Lando Calrissian element of this pirate who has been forced to kind of figure out how to run an actual society and make a functional government and all that stuff, we channel through Romulus. But at the end of the day, Romulus is a character from Fourth Rome, who was, who thinks that he's descended from gods. He has left to kind of find his fortune, has had a number of adventures, including crossing paths with Core and Hope in the past, and has landed in Treasure Island, where he has kind of taken over, and he runs, Treasure Island and this kind of den of thieves and ne'er-do-wells that all look up to him. He's got a badass suit of powered armor, which Lando never had. So,
is there a Remus?
A Remus in terms of Remus? No, not yet. That's a good, that's a good question. Not yet. Maybe at some point.
In the fourth issue, Romulus and Iris have a big fight, and I'm reading that, and I'm reading that, and then I realize, are these first 9 pages one image?
Yeah, I think I have it right in front of me. I have to look at it. Maybe.
Like, you haven't noticed that Jim did that?
No, I did. No, totally. But yeah.
Wait. Because I was gonna ask, how did you guys collaborate on that particular sequence?
Well, so that would have been in the script, right? Where we again, the way that Jim likes to write the scripts, he puts in as much detail he feels he needs to kind of recall when he's doing the art, and we it's funny because when we're writing it, we're usually writing it for like our imaginary readers, like edited image, right? We submit scripts there, but in general for him, I think a lot of it is him trying to capture the how he wants things to flow. So I'd have to go back and look at the script, but I would be shocked if we didn't call out that it was going to be kind of one image broken up by some of these bubbles and certain shapes, right, which tie back into some of the other stuff that's going on. I know even as I'm flipping through the issue, right, there's a whole section that has foreground elements of these kind of giant underwater mushrooms. Like those would be the types of things that we would usually call out too. So, but again, I'm not an artist, right? So I have no way to I visualize it in my head, but it never comes close to what's actually on the final page,
Yeah, I get to that and I'm like, are these 9 pages one image? And then I get to the 10th page and I was like, oh, they didn't go the whole way.
Yeah. You have to ask him about that. I don't know.
I have to ask about Alias 5 because what a twist there, right? Because he's doing this interview and then you think it's regular back matter stuff for that, that's been common since Watchmen. It turns out the interview's happening at the same time. And then it turns out, well, there's a twist at the end where, well, now he's just stuck now.
Yeah.
How important was it for you to have these segments with Alias 5, and will we see Alias 5 in the main story?
So again, it was an afterthought, to be honest, originally, right? We're like, hey, let's do this because it's cool. Watchmen did it. It was awesome. And I can't remember where the idea came from, but it was like, and I think part of it too was, it might have come from us being a little bit, be quite honest, being a little bit insecure that, hey, we started the story in the middle. It's going at a breakneck pace. We don't have a lot of time to do any character development. In this first issue, I think there's some, right? But there's certainly not the same level of conversations that you get in like what issue 4 or whatever, where they're all hanging out and having these conversations, right? And you're getting to see a little bit more insight into the characters. Or that issue 5, I guess, right?
5,
so yeah, they all run together in my head.
Of course, I understand.
Those conversations, with Dina and Castro, for example. And we don't really get to take a breath. So I think, my guess is when we first came up with the idea, a lot of it was driven by like, hey, we want to spend a little bit more time getting to know the wizard. How can we do that? Let's do it as an interview, right? So he's being interviewed and he gets to talk about some of these big lofty themes and ideas, and we get to see a little bit more of who he is and describe his place in the world. So we came up with the idea of the journalist that would be doing the interview. And honestly, I thought, maybe we do it for an issue or two, and then we replace it with some other back matter. And like Watchmen did, right? Where you had, the back matter was kind of different in almost every issue. But we liked the idea and we kept going with it, and it kept ending on kind of these little cliffhangers. We're like, well, let's just keep going. Let's just keep going. We had no idea when we started issue 1 that by issue 6, that turn was going to happen. And I think it came up on like maybe when we were writing issue 5, and I think Jim came up with the notion of like, well, what happens if we do this? Like, I was like, oh yeah, cool. Let's go that, like, make that a little bit more sinister, right? And show, but also hopefully what comes across too is that like, not like the guy's not a little bit excited about it, right? Because now he's getting access to the wizard in this really kind of formative time, and he basically is like, well, someday I'm gonna write this guy's biography and be famous, right? So there's playing with a little bit of that too, of that temptation of like, do you want to be the devil's biographer or not? And what's the risk there? But really, it was one of those things that like which is one of the things I really enjoy about working on this book, that we can do that because it's ours, right? Like, oh, let's keep him around for 6 issues and have him end up being kind of captured. He's definitely coming back. I mean, in terms of we want to continue the interviews and the kind of documentation of what's going on from kind of a different point of view, and see how the wizard views some of the events that are happening, because he's not in those scenes with Hope to talk about it, right? Whether or not he ever shows up in the book or not, I don't, that's TBD still. We're not,
Okay.
Yeah.
I love the fake ads that you guys run in the back, and I feel like there's hints and pieces throughout that whole thing, like where Betty the lizard is. But my favorite thing is Here We Ego, which are 2 robots, which I always think is you and Jim.
So he thinks that too, and it's not. So this is the thing that's so funny. So well, which one's which is the question. That's
right.
Who's am I the orb, or am I the automaton?
It's not necessarily one robot mapping to another, to one of you.
Yeah.
It's just it sounds like the 2 of you are talking about the book.
Yeah. So I'll tell you where that came from. And this is, again, one of the things that maybe I'm most proud of, because it's maybe my most, one of the big stamps that I did put on the book. So when I was in college, the only way I could focus in class was to doodle. I don't know why. I could not. Note taking didn't, like, there's just something in my brain that if I'm, and even at work now, I'll be in a big important meeting, we'll be talking about budgets and things like that, and I'll remember all the numbers that are talked about if I'm drawing, if I'm doodling, not if I'm writing down the numbers. I don't know why my brain is wired that way, but it is. So in college, but I'm not a very good artist, right? So I just used to do stick figures, and then the stick figures evolved into the that kind of automaton character who's literally based off those those posable models, right? That artists use to. Yeah. It's just that I had one in my my room in college, and for whatever reason. And I think my roommate had it or whatever. And I was like, well, I can draw that. Like that's just a bunch of cylinders, right? And then the other robot was it's a circle with a little fin on it. No big deal. So I used to draw that all the time. And it was all these one-shot little cartoons. And it was all about my mood of the day, right? If I was in a bad mood, the characters would be in a bad mood. If I was, if I had a crush on somebody, they'd be talking to each other about what to do about the crush. And it was just my way of kind of venting. So a lot of it is that we're using it to, I think, channel some of our hopes and our fears, maybe. So if you read it, I mean, I think it absolutely is us trying to find a way to, I think, express our feelings about working on the book, and I think when you read it with that in that light, maybe it I don't know if it makes them funnier or makes them tragic or what, but it was a fun way to kind of channel some of that stuff. And then obviously Jim's doing the art, not me, right? So like I was like I don't look terrible, right? So he's and he's brought these characters to life in a way that I never could.
The one where the big robot is holding out his heart, and then
I think
like,
that's the very first one, right?
Yeah, it's like, well, what are we gonna do? It's like, does it matter? You're not putting it back now.
Yeah. So again, that's probably really easy to read into, right? It's like it's out there, it's in the world now. This thing, Echolands, that we love and that we've been working on for 10 years, it's out there now. We can't put it back. Everybody owns it now, and we could, it's not going to be that. I listened to this one podcast, Best Movies Never Made, and it's all about movies that never got made. And sometimes, and a lot of the people that are on are like, I wish that movie would have got made. But every once in a while, you get somebody that's very nostalgic and be like, you know what, this movie maybe is just even better in my head. Like it's just better that it never got made because it will always exist in this one kind of in my vision of it, right? And I don't have to watch it get kind of ruined by a director turning into something else or by fans tearing it apart or whatever, right? So there's always that weird tension of like, I've been living with this thing for 10 years. We've been living with this thing for 10 years, and now we're giving it up to people who are going to interpret it in whatever way they want,
Congratulations. It's off to a great start.
Cool, thank you.
The hardcover is out in June. Do you know what's going to go into it?
Not as well as Jim probably does, right? Jim's been helping to assemble it, right? So it's obviously the first 6 issues, and you should ask him that. He can probably lay out everything that's going in there. I know that there's some extras that are going in.
Yeah, we'll probably talk at some point before it comes out.
Cool.
And so yeah, congratulations. Of course, you do work in video games, and you did mention maybe making this into a game at some point.
Maybe.
On a scale of 1 to 100, how feasible is that at this point?
I don't know. I mean, I always joke with Jim. I was like, it's the most expensive game ever made, right? If we make it, because of and again, there's technologies that we can invest in that would make it easier, but it's that combining of art styles and it all depends on the type of game it was too, right? If it was a 2D adventure game, it'd be much easier to do than if it was with all those different art styles, than if it's a full-on 3D open world, RPG or whatever, right? Which
can this be anything other than an open world RPG though?
That's what I would want it to be, right? For me, that's like that would be the dream, right? So I don't know that we're ready yet, in terms of even the industry, just because it's like simple things like having, characters that are all radically different heights and widths, means that it makes it really hard to reuse animation, from, walk cycles and things like that. You have to retarget them, and you have to do, all kinds of other things. So there are processes and there's technologies that we can invest in order to make that easier. But, the look and feel of the game, making sure that all the different art styles come together, the level of detail, like that's just a huge art undertaking. So it's not impossible. It's just really expensive, theoretically, technically, but I would love to do it someday. I mean, I think that it would make a super cool setting for a game. I'm a big RPG. I love Skyrim and, Assassin's Creed, and I'm playing Horizon Forbidden West right now. So I really love open world RPGs, and yeah, there you go. Awesome.
I was playing it right before this interview. It's so good.
Cool. No, it's awesome. I mean, I love both those games, and Elden Ring, I think, is on my front porch right now. I gotta go pick that, grab that from my front porch. So I'll be playing that too. So, but being able to, I mean, could you imagine creating a character in this world and being able to go explore this world as a character you create who maybe could be drawn from one of these lands, and I'm running around as a kind of a Dick Tracy inspired gangster, and you're running around as a black and white vampire. Like the possibilities would be amazing and endless. But I think, I want us to get the comic under our belt, and then
Would it be an
the other side of it
MMORPG?
is- Well, maybe, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
like that would be even better, right? But it's just, again, I don't know who's going to write that check.
And I would also be interested to see if you guys will be doing spin-offs for Echolands, like focusing on different characters.
That's something we've talked a little bit about. I mean, I would love to do it because I think the world's really rich and the characters are too, right? And I think there's a lot to explore. In that, we don't have any concrete plans yet, but it's something we've definitely talked about. And we, again, going back to that Bible, I mean, for every, one story point that we've committed to in this arc, we probably have 5 or 6 other ideas that, won't ever see the light of day, right? So in this particular, arc. So I'm hopeful that we can do other things. I definitely think because it does lend itself to the world is built from all these different art styles. I think it could be really interesting to say, well, we know there's this artist over here who's really talented doing this thing, right? Is there a way for us to tell a story in an environment that really leans into that artist's strengths and that their style, right? And even create a land around their style. Like, I think there's some really cool things that we can do there. I just don't, we're just not ready to do that yet because we're still getting our feet under us with the first arc,
How many more lands have you worked out that we haven't seen a representative of?
Well, I'd have to go look at the Bible. I mean, we probably have at least 15 or 20 that we've referenced. And we know what they are. Like when we reference something, and this is me, I kind of have to understand this just to make sure that we don't just drop these references and they don't, end up conflicting or whatever. So anytime we drop a reference, I'll go into the Bible and I'll write up at least a sentence or two description of what it could be. And then Jim and I agree, yeah, that's what we want to do, right? So I think we've easily referenced a dozen, and we've only seen a handful so far, right? There's in the next arc, we have plans to go to at least 3 different areas, over the course of a couple issues. So, you'll see more of the world as we kind of run through that. And then again, we'll be continuing. One of the things again, working on Star Wars, it's so great about Star Wars, the idea of hidden history, right? Yeah, Obi-Wan mentions the Clone Wars in the first Star Wars. I'm like, what's the Clone Wars? That sounds cool. So, that was a lesson I took from working on Star Wars, like always try and feed as much of this kind of hidden history and plant seeds for the rest of the world if you can. So we throw out references to other characters and lands and other stuff all the time without any kind of, description of what those things are yet. So I think, it's already pretty rich.
And if you want to pick it up along the way at some point, then you can. It's there.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Congratulations, Haden
Cool,
Blackman.
thank you so much.
This is off to a great start. I can't wait for the
Thanks.
rest.
I really
of the
enjoyed it, man. I really appreciate you taking the time. This was a really fun conversation. I don't think I enjoy talking about anything more than talking about Echolands. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.